South Africa, we've got 9 ethnic groups with 11 languages. If you look at Nigeria, 250 ethnic groups. You look at Democratic Republic of the Congo, 250 ethnic groups, 700 local languages. Zambia, 70 indigenous speaking groups, and so on. The reason I mention that is simply to indicate that if you decentralize to subnational level or to local government level, you want to make use of information technology, you want to practice governance, one will have to take into account the fact that it's not in one language that you can provide the service. It's not to one ethnic group only or to one group. There are, as we know, some tensions in some countries, like in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and in other countries as well, where there are extreme differences of opinion, political differences, language differences, cultural differences between Muslim and Christian, and so on. The second column, I just indicated there, also the difference in the population density, because I want to come back to that a little bit later on. And you will notice that in the case of Namibia, it's only about 2.7 persons per square kilometer. In Botswana, it's 4.02 persons per square kilometer. That means that people are living far away from one another. It means, again, that technology, electronic technology may not be that easily available in sparsely populated areas. We visited one area last year in South Africa where the town, Uppington, is 250 kilometers away from the next town at Meer with 800 people. Now that municipality alone is 40,000 square kilometers. It's bigger than some countries that I know. And how do you deliver services to that 800 people in the Meer area where they don't have access to telephones or cell phones or anything like that? So one has to just bear in mind also that density. In other countries, like in South Africa, in the Gauteng province, we've got 9 provinces. The one is Gauteng, and that is 743. But in the city of Johannesburg, the population density is more than 3,000 per square kilometer. So with a higher density, it's easier to provide some of the information technology and the services that are required. I think that gives one an idea of the diversity of Africa and also the diversity that you find in each of the countries. Here I just try to put a little bit more focus on what the effects are on the for e-governance. If you look at the different countries, I've already referred to that, so I'm not going to elaborate on that, but you will notice the limited telecommunication. The cost involved is a little bit higher because you have to make use of other technology to be able to provide that service. For example, in the case of the Uppington Meer one that I mentioned, the medical services have to be provided by Uppington, which is 250 kilometers away. A clinic cannot operate on a daily basis and things like that. Accessibility is a problem. And then densely populated, I've already indicated that, so I need not refer to it, but the advantage is of the densely populated areas, electricity is readily available, whether it's formal or informal, or whether you tap into another system, but electricity is more or less available to everyone. But there are challenges also regarding, for example, South Africa, where our indigent, the poor people, comprise about between 45 and 49% in the metropolitan municipalities. That means those are people that cannot pay rates and taxes. Very few of them pay electricity. And that means that the rest of the community within those areas, they must pay the rates and taxes. So it puts a tremendous strain on the municipalities to be able to provide the particular services. As far as the political decentralization is concerned, one must bear in mind that there are political dominance in some of the units, especially where you have clans or ethnic groups and so on, which may be dominant in one area and not in another. So if you decentralize, one has to bear in mind that careful note should be taken of the presence of those groups in those areas. Cultural differences, and I found that in some cases there's even a problem with the credibility of the government structures, because in some cases it's very sensitive who the officials are that are appointed in a particular government department in a particular area. If they don't belong to that cultural group, it's rather difficult to have the community accept that they will provide the services in an equitable manner. Also, one must bear in mind that in most cases, except, as I said, in Nigeria, there is no real devolution. In all cases, although they profess that devolution takes place, you will find that national government can actually pass legislation on anything. Like in South Africa, it's clearly stated that the three spheres of government are interdependent, interrelated, and interdependent on each other. But national government or parliament can pass legislation on any matter, irrespective of whether it's assigned to a province or not. It can pass legislation to promote national unity, economic stability, perform duties to ensure that services are provided up to a particular standard. And I also found that regional initiatives to introduce e-governance is rather limited in most of the municipalities. As far as the administrative decentralization is concerned, what is important is that if you do make use of decentralization for the purposes of e-governance, IT, and so on, one has to ensure that the subunits have the administrative as well as the managerial competence to provide that service. For example, in South Africa, there's a serious problem at the moment with the lack of capacity in the municipalities. And by the way, in South Africa, the total area of the country had been divided into municipalities. But in more than 50% of the municipalities, there's a lack of competence as far as the financial officials are concerned, and as well as the heads of administration. We call them municipal managers. So the problem is that the services are not provided as intended. One of the primary requirements for any level of government to operate effectively and efficiently is that it must have sufficient financial sources. And except for Kenya, most of the other countries have a lack of finance at the municipal level. They don't have sufficient revenue. I just put a few down there to indicate what the situation is. Only in the DRC, there's a fixed percentage, and in Namibia, subnational governments are financed with 5% of revenue from the local level. And in South Africa, there is a so-called equitable share from the National Revenue Fund, but if you look at it, you'll notice that only 13% of that fund ultimately, together with the grants, go to municipalities, although most of the services are delivered by municipalities or takes place within a municipality. Their funds are insufficient, especially also if you take into account the indigent as well as the higher rate of migrants that we get in South Africa. Though the migrants as well, they are entitled to services, they demand the services. Court recently decided that housing is everyone is entitled to housing. So if you are in South Africa, you're entitled to housing, whether you're a citizen or not. It depends naturally on the sources, what kind of housing, but they are entitled to housing the same as South African citizens. And then the last point is just that the capacity of the region to provide that service, I think, is particularly important. One form of, and that is a very weak form of decentralization, is deconcentration, but that simply implies that you make use of branch offices for departments. It eases the burden of central department. In South Africa also we have central department responsible for social grants and so on. And by the way, in South Africa, 17 million people receive grants, child grant and old age pensions and so on, out of a population of about 56 million. That's the official figure. Unofficial figure is much higher. But the problem is with the statistics, they only take into account those people that they can count, not those that they can't count. But I think one could delegate the decision making, but what is important, and that I want to come back to accountability, is the need for monitoring and evaluation on a continuous basis to determine whether those services are provided as expected. But it can assist in electronic service provision by way of information sharing, and also it involves the recipients and potential recipients more directly, because the service provider is much nearer to the community that's being served. Public-private partnerships and privatisation, I think that's a well-known fact that we are making more and more use of the private sector to assist or to provide a particular service. If you use the private sector, there's less political interference, that's in theory. And it's not necessarily cheaper. It's only cheaper, and that is Professor Nemec did that research in Slovakia, only viable, only cheaper if there are sufficient possible tenderers and contractors available that can compete for a particular contract. If you don't have sufficient people, then the price goes up and the tariff goes up. And the cases that he mentioned, it's up to 80% more expensive in some cases. But still, if you do privatize, there's still a need for the public sector to be accountable for what is being done. Again, if you appoint a private contractor to provide a service and the private contractor should not perform the service, then the public sector must take over that function. In some cases, it becomes more expensive. In the case of fire brigade, I know in Benoni, in our own city in Tshwane, there was a problem with the electronic devices for electricity payments and so on that didn't work out, and now the municipality is required to do that. Deregulation, I'm not going to spend much time on that. It means that you take away or you repeal the legislation and allow the private sector to perform the duties freely. In South Africa, again, one case of the taxi industry, we've got two types of taxis, if you would call it that way. The one is the meter taxi that has a meter in the cab that you can see what it costs. The other is a more informal, and that is the greatest part of them. And then we have the Uber taxis, and I think most of you know that's the electronic hailing system for taxis. Unfortunately, there's a huge outcry from the meter taxis that they've got to stick to particular routes, and Uber can go wherever they want to. So although it's electronic advisable, there's still the problem of ensuring that they comply with a particular conditions set by government. The advantages and disadvantages or problems or challenges with electronic governance: it promotes democratic government, it brings it closer to the society, it increases the involvement of society, and it counters autocratic government. But the challenges are the lack of administrative and managerial capacity of the lower levels. If you do not ensure that the lower levels have sufficient properly capacitated officials or even councillors in the municipal side, you cannot perform that function properly. And also loss of economies of scale, because now you've got